and the brief summary, and the Professor Su, please.
Okay, so I'm going to provide a very brief summary of what we've talked about. Could we go to the next slide, please, Masa? Okay, so we had these 4 presentations covering different areas, and if we go to the next slide, Professor Akiyama presented some overall lessons learned from the fact that we had earthquakes, but we had damage from multiple hazards, and he provided then the example of the Nankai Trough to illustrate the risk estimation and methods to enhance resilience. And then at the end, he highlighted waste management and education and demonstrated these others. Professor Riley focused on policy, but demonstrated the connections between public assistance and enhancing resilience. She also identified equity issues and discussed ways to improve policy, illustrating how we use the various analytical techniques as we look at the implications of different policy. Then Mr. Asada reviewed recent disasters due to flooding and noted significant economic and social loss, so broadening it out from just the physical loss, but also recognizing that climate change required long-term solutions. So then he explored some very elaborate techniques for river basin management that really enhance resilience and sustainability, and that these sustainable solutions require recognition of inequalities and lots of different stakeholders to be involved. And then in the last presentation, Professor Takahashi reviewed the sort of the status of infrastructure in Japan and the role of the structural engineer, and looked at this idea of the need to cope beyond basic design, design basis events, the special events, and that's motivated the need to develop new technologies, but also recognizing this idea that there's a broader aspect. So what I want to do is put these in the context of the framework that we talked about in the session on Tuesday. This is the elaborate version of the graphic, but if you go to the next slide, there's an approximate version of it where it looks at this idea of system assessment and management and governments. And the first talk talked about system assessment, earthquakes and related hazards. Then we moved to Professor Riley's talk talking about public policy, focusing on this area down the bottom, but using the larger pieces of the framework to fill it into that. Then we came back and looked at the infrastructure system from the point of view of flooding and river basin management. So you saw a broad overview of seeing many different elements of the assessment and management and governance coming together. And then Professor Takahashi came back at the end in the next, should be one more. Nope. All right. And in particular looked at, there it is in the orange, this idea of seismic events and focusing on these particular areas related to more the engineering side, but recognizing that we have to build back into the performance and link into the broader social, economic, and community well-being. So I think we've had an interesting set of examples of different pieces of the framework, and so we're going to open it up for some Q&A. My colleague, Professor Koike, is going to start off with the questions, and then we'll flip back and forth between us. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Su, for your summary, not only each lecture, but also the whole structure of this session. Thank you. We have now the 7 question, and first 2 question they are written in Japanese, but maybe these 2 questions lead to the Professor Riley's the talk about the insurance. So there are 2 questions on insurance. The first one, in US, this insurance can encourage the people to move from the high risk area to low risk area. Such kind of the function could be expected in US. That is the first question with regard to the insurance. And the second one is, I'm not sure, but some additional cost, additional payment at the rate above, the usage charge could be used for the investment, therefore the improving the infrastructure. Such kind of the additional cost above the usage charge could be used for the upgrading the infrastructure. Such kind of the policy is now under consideration, or the is adopting in the US. That is a question to you.
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, those are both really great questions. So insurance, there are different markets for different types of insurance in the United States, and I'm guessing just like in Japan. So it's interesting. So like, for example, the National Flood Insurance Program does flood insurance in the United States. And so if you live in a flood zone defined as a 100-year flood event, you know, we could debate about what that should be, but classically defined in a flood zone, you're supposed to have flood insurance. So only about 50% of people who live in a floodplain do have flood insurance, but that's another topic. Flood insurance is backed by the federal government. It's issued by private insurance companies, but the company that insures flood hazard areas is the US government. And if there are major losses, the US Treasury bears the responsibility. What's really interesting about the flood insurance program back in the 1960s when it began is that it started with this idea that if people knew that they lived in a flood zone, that they would purchase flood insurance and ultimately would decide to move because they learned that they lived in a flood zone. And we've seen that it has exactly the opposite. Just like every other insurance program, it creates a moral hazard and induces people to stay. So there isn't a lot of movement. If you have insurance, I mean, it covers usually your largest asset, which is your house. And so you usually will reside there. There are a number of homes that have, I should say not a number, there are tens of thousands of homes that have had repetitive flood losses. I'm talking floods like over the last 30 years that have flooded more than 10 times, more than 10,000 homes in the United States have had these type of repetitive flood losses. But there's not strong incentives to move. There are relocation programs for repetitive flood loss houses. They're not well coordinated. They break up communities, they break up social networks. And they're often done ad hoc. So what it does is it lowers the people who stay, it lowers the property value of the people who stay, and it makes providing infrastructure for the people who stay more expensive because all of a sudden the road just became marginally more expensive to maintain. So they tend not to be great programs. We also often find that people who live in floodplains are connected to the water somehow, or in some way. So when they move to another floodplain. Or if they get a buyout, they then move to another flood zone. So these programs tend not to be terribly effective, and we don't see insurance actually inducing like less hazard or in the future. I think that there was another question you said about should user rates go towards mitigation, and I think that's such a difficult topic. So probably so for electric power, which is a huge industry in the United States, Fortune 10 companies, they're responsible. They don't receive public funds after disasters. They can get rate increases, but they don't generally get disaster aid from the government. They are in charge, they have certain regulatory requirements for maintaining power. And so because they're for-profit companies, they have the money to put in concrete poles, they have the finances, but there's also real large, well, in principle, we don't usually see this play out, but there are penalties for long duration outages, but those don't usually get applied. So I guess, but it really depends on the agency. So like the MTA in New York City doesn't have the type of capital to put in a flood wall to protect its transit infrastructure. So I don't think, it depends. So they would rely on a federal program for mitigation. I think that there's more money coming for mitigation, but we're finding that the people who get mitigation money tend to be local areas that have a lot of capacity. So they happen to be areas that are wealthy to begin with, so they have people who can write these grants and really receive more money. So, and they're less likely to put money towards really big, expensive, or things that would reduce losses the most, because they know in the future they won't get as much money after disasters because they won't have as much losses after a disaster. So it's this really perversive program of how mitigation money is spent, because you really don't want to, you want to make sure you still have a disaster in the future, because you still get this money in the future from the feds. So I think that there are a lot of disincentives, but I think in terms of rate payment, who gets for rate increases, it really depends. It's sector specific, and if it's for-profit, nonprofit, and who's kind of doing the financing of it.
Okay, thank you very much. ちょっと日本語でも簡単にお答えを説明しておいた方が良いと思いますが、まあ、必ずしも保険はその人がこう動いてリロケーションするのに必ずしも、有効というわけではないというのが実態のようです。それから、まあ、各、まあ、企業体はまあ、かなりギリギリの損得計算で動いているので、なかなかそういう将来の、まあ、災害防止のためにこうコストを上乗せするというようなことは現実でなかなか難しいというようなご回答であったと思います。Thank you very much, there, Professor Riley. I would ask the Professor Su to cover the next question.
All right. So I'm going to propose a question to Professor Akiyama. So this is a combination of a couple of questions related to some of the ideas he presented. So one of them was he talked about temporary bridges, and the question was, how do we actually make this happen? And then someone else asked, presenting new technologies, but what does he think of Professor Takahashi's metabolic columns? And then a third question that I wanted to tie some of this together is, how does he see this resilience sustainability fitting together? Because he had mentioned the idea of sustainable practices. So a 3-in-1 question there.
Yeah, Professor Akiyama, please turn on mic.
Thank you. So, for first question, of course, there are many things to implement. We already developed design methodologies for conventional bridges. However, we don't have it for temporary bridges. So we have to develop design methodologies for temporary bridge for prompt construction. So for temporary bridges, probably we can make a difference. For example, design load could be reduced because the temporary bridge would be used only for a few years. So considering this point, we have to develop some design methodologies. Of course, and also, I believe it's very important to identify the locations with high hazard. And also, it's very important to identify which bridges would be vulnerable, and also which bridge would affect the functionality after the big disasters. So I believe a risk-based approach would be useful. So also for second question, idea from Takashi Sensei, always fantastic. So, and I believe he focused on structures subjected to ground motion. But in my presentation, I wanted to say some actions like tsunami and landslide, it's impossible to prevent to protect the structures from collapse, because the action is too excessive. During the 2011 Great Japan earthquake, some superstructures were displaced more than a few hundred meters from the original position. So for this kind of catastrophic event, so we have to consider, we have to assume if structure collapse, what we have to do. So I presented one idea is a temporary bridge. So of course, Takashi's idea is fantastic, but I take a different approach. Okay. And the third question was what?
Sustainability and resilience.
It's you're asking about the long-term performance?
Well, it's the connection, yes.
Sustainability and sustainability. So in my point of view, sustainability and resilience, sustainability can include the concept of resilience. So sustainability, I believe, focus on just after the disaster, but sustainability, in sustainability, so we have to consider more, we have to consider long-term performance from design to depth of the structure. So this is an answer to you. It's okay.
Yeah.
And may I add a short comment from me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. And yeah, maybe that so in the proposed structures by the Professor Akiyama and my proposal is completely different, but that is very exciting and for us because that the role of our structural engineers and they provide that different countermeasure. And I think that the diversity in the technological and the countermeasure is good for that increase that increase the resilience. So that is my point. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Professor Koike for maybe one more question because thank you for the comments. We've got a lot of questions, and we're going to run out of time, but they will be responded to eventually on the website. So Professor Koike.
Okay, Professor, I'm sorry. Two more questions.
Okay.
First one is to Mr. Asada. The one question is, in Japan, we are using the benefit to cost for evaluation of the infrastructure, the investment. Is it appropriate for the just the management or infrastructure, the construction? For example, the super broad levy with multiple functions, super table, cannot be accepted as from the standpoint of the B by C。浅田さんの、質問の欄に出ていると思いますが、公共投資は B by C によって評価されているけど、この防災、この方法は防災投資には不適ではないかと。まあ、スーパー堤防は B by C で仕分けされてしまっているという、ご指摘があるんですが、何かお考えございますでしょうか。
浅田です。ありがとうございます。2つだけお話しさせていただくと、やっぱり、B by C だけで測れないっていうふうなものが存在しているっていうことはしっかり認識すべきだと思います。それに対してのアプローチとして、きちんとその便益といったものを、いろんな形で、その B を増やすことが目的ではなくて、きちんとその付加的な効果とかそういったものをちゃんと評価するということが大事かなというふうに思います。それと、やはりB by C だけで表せないもの、定性的なものも含めて総合的な判断といったものが必要なんじゃないかなというふうに思います。で、特にスーパー堤防、高規格堤防の場合、その効果といったものがなかなかその稀な現象でしか発揮されないっていうふうな、そういったその住民の暮らしとでその効果といったものを実感しにくいような施設といったものをいざという時のためにどういうふうに評価しておくかというのは確かに我々に求められている課題でもあるかな、あるいは社会とも共有していかないといけないのかなというふうに思います。以上でございます。
どうもありがとうございます。 Yes, indeed, it's very difficult to evaluate the infrastructure for the disaster risk reduction only by using benefit to cost ratio. We need to consider the additional merit, which cannot be evaluated by the money. That should be considered and shared the benefit among the wide society. And especially the very small, low frequency event, it's very difficult for people to understand the risk. So in advance, so we need to share the risk among the society. そういうお答えだったと思います。浅田さんどうもありがとう。So my last question is to Mr. Asada and to Alison. This comes from not the audience but the organizing committee. Incentive for disaster risk reduction and improve their resilience. In Japan, as Mr. Asada introduced, all stakeholders involvement and develop such kind of place for discussion is now being encouraged. That is the kind of the whole society approach. In case of the US, what kind of the encouraging people or municipality or the enterprise to make effort for reducing the disaster risk? What kind of the incentive is a function? So that is a question. So I think Asada-sanからは流域治水で、by all stakeholder という形で示されましたけど、アメリカではどうでしょうかということを聞こうと思っております。Professor Riley, can you respond to my the question from the organizing committee?
Sure. So if I just to recap it, it was what kind of, is there stakeholder engagement when looking at hazard reduction, and in somewhat related, is there how do you incentivize stakeholders to reduce their risk? Yeah, so I think that's like a very active area of discussion about how to get stakeholders involved, and there's certainly a lot of examples that have been pretty poignant about collective relocation, going back to the 1970s of towns getting together and deciding to collectively relocate in flood areas. Like in Soldiers Grove, there's some case studies of Native American, that there's collective relocation, but there's been financial backing from the federal government. I mean, there is certainly more discussion, especially with like where to put green infrastructure, and there's certainly, but I do think there's a lot of discussion about, how do we get more involvement, especially in areas that have been excluded from the conversation for so long. So in the United States, there are areas that the quality of the infrastructure is just poor because they've been historically segregated or historically underinvested in due to redlining and other policies. So you have poor quality of infrastructure. And so now we have to have the discussion about how do we make sure we have investments that are more equitable to, but that goes everything from improving governance, and how do you have from really centralized to decentralized systems. And so I do think that there's more, but there's I think still a lot of work to do. I guess in terms of incentives, I think I think I think it's such a hard question, but it's so important, right?
Yes.
Just how do you start to induce people to make better decisions to reduce their own risk, given that it's such a complicated and it's not their main priority. Like most at least Americans, they're trying to just get food on the table, get to their job, get their kids to bed, you know, that it's not, you know, preparing for the flood. So it is a complicated process. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of good discussion about it, but I think there's still a lot of work to do.
Okay, thank you very much. We Japanese are now struggling, and they make an effort. That the new policy, the new exist is called as in English, the river basin disaster resilience and sustainability by all. That is the name, English name of the new policy. But we are now challenging. Okay, to develop such a policy. Thank you very much. So I would pass the microphone to the MC, Professor Takahashi.
Okay, so thank you very much, that Professor Koike and McNeil, and also that thank you very much for the all and the panelists. And so this is a very exciting and the discussions, and also that so thank you very much for joining us and for all the participants. So and today that we have the limited time, and so therefore it is impossible to answer all questions, but so we are ready to prepare that so and the answers for the all questions and through that the web page. Okay, so we'd like to feedback that from you. And so thank you very much for joining us. And so next in the day 3, okay, so let's meet at the day 3. So day 3 was held on April 28th in Japan and the 27th and in United States. Okay, so see you at the day 3. And thank you very much for in the Orwa. Thank you.